We have Beverley Danielle here. She is a tarot reader, an energy healer, and also a life coach. And today she's going to be sharing many of her paranormal and some of her spiritual experiences, exploring clairaudience, opening that door to spirit guide communication, beloved pets in spirit. Do they enter the afterlife? And can they visit us? Hi, Beverley. It's great to have you here with us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Anna.
So would you like to give us some of your background?
Yeah, so I actually do tarot readings mixed with life coaching. And so through, working with clients and being able to talk with them, both what's coming out of the cards and what I'm getting intuitively, it's sort of like I'm not the type to speak up and share. So through working with this modality, it allows me to sort of like heal myself as I help others heal. So the paranormal aspect is sort of like having that connection to, source or higher power, however people address it, and allowing that to sort of come through and delivering messages to the clients. Yeah, so for my background, my mother's actually from Singapore. So, some people think that the tarot is like a taboo thing, but for me, it's like it was almost like kind of normalized because we grew up Catholic, but in Singapore, it's almost like everybody and their grandmother has a deck, and it's just like, oh, something going on, like somebody get the deck. So I wasn't afraid of it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's great. So when you work with your clients, whether it be long distance or whether it be in person, do you find that you get, whether paranormal beings is the term I'm going to use, but we're talking sort of spirits of past loved ones, or sometimes the darker energies are present? Do you find you get a mix of different types of energy beings that come through the readings?
So that to me sounds almost like mediumship, but I don't consider myself a medium because I don't exactly, have the ability to communicate with like random spirits. It's almost like I have my own team and they talk to or connect with, or they'll show me like, different images, or I get like almost like a knowing drops in. But for my main like ability, it's clairaudience. So I'm able to sort of like hear what's going on. So for me, it's
Ah.
being able to slow my nervous system down enough in order to receive those messages. It's like becoming a conduit.
Wow. So, what do you hear? Are you able to share sort of some of the types of information that you hear? How you hear it as well? Is it words, statements? Do you see words that you kind of hear, but you don't see them, if that makes sense? Like sometimes the way that this works can be quite, I find it's quite unusual sometimes that I will see words but I'll kind of hear them, but then they disappear. It's really random. Do you get random things that happen like that?
So for me, I was around 12 or 13 when it sort of started to develop. And it's almost like what I'll call an evolution. So when I first started, it was like being able to hear it. So I don't hear it like in my own voice. It's almost like others. And it's not quite like through your ear. It's almost like a little bit higher, like almost like in the middle of your brain. Like they just kind of talk really distinctly, and I'll know it's them. Like, oh, like I'm, getting some kind of information here. So one of the first instances, I was in class and all of a sudden like they were like my best friend was standing next to me, and one of the entities was like, "Oh, tell her to get up on the counter." And I was like, "Oh, that's really strange. Like I'm not going to do that. That's just out of left field." And all of a sudden the teacher walked over and asked my best friend to climb up on the counter and get a box from the top of a shelf. And I was like, "Ooh." And then another instance, years later, I was outside my doctor's office and I needed to run in and get some papers. And that same voice was like, "Take the umbrella." And I was like, "But it's like sunny with clear skies. There's nothing." But I said to myself, you know what? I used to call it the voice. So it was like, oh, this voice is never wrong. Let me just, take the umbrella. Why not? So I literally ran in the building for maybe 4 minutes and I came out and it was downpouring so hard that you like couldn't even walk. So it was like, all right, this one is never wrong. So I tend to listen to it.
Don't you love that? I love it. I get the same sort of thing. I get really random things sometimes for me or for clients because of the house healing work. I'm tuning into people's homes and there's all sorts of stuff there. And do you find that the more of this work that you do, the more in tune you are becoming with the voice or other voices? Do you get one or more than one that talks to you, with maybe for different aspects of your life? Do you have a voice for home, a voice for work, a voice for, I don't know, socializing or helping you when you're out?
So as we were just talking and I was saying it's almost like an evolution, it started as I could only like hear them. So there was one main, I call it like my main guide. He's the one that's always been with me through most of the journey, I guess I'll say. And then with more recently, as I'm sort of like doing the work to like, reset my nervous system, sort of like traumatic childhood work and things like that, it's like I'm getting the ability to like see things or know things or, different kind of whispers coming in. But I find, it's almost like you have like a multiple team and like sometimes other ones will drop in and say something. So it just really depends. But that one main guide has always been with me. And then when I was about 12, I'm not sure why, but the only person that knows about this was my grandmother. And I had actually predicted someone's death. And it was one of, someone that I had gone to school with. He was 2 years older. And so I'm not sure how or why, but I was sitting with my grandmother one evening and I said to her, oh, this individual fell down the basement steps. It's like cement steps and he like injured his head and that the doctors couldn't do anything about it and that all the friends were crying. So it turned out, there was a instance where this individual had basically a traumatic head injury. And after that, the doctors couldn't do anything. And at the wake, all the friends were crying. So it was almost like exact prediction. So that kind of freaked me out back then. And, you kind of like push it down. And I only recently remembered that story. So that was when I was about 12. So it's like, over 30 years ago, this happened. And I'm only just remembering it now because as I'm doing the work to, release trauma and reset my nervous system, is essentially what happens is like stories like that. It's almost like it's safe for them to come out, even though they freak you out.
I was going to say, as you were talking, I'm going, that person's higher self knew that you would hear, that you would listen, and that you would be someone that could acknowledge that experience that was happening at that time. Because energy is universal. Like, I mean, I can work on a house in Singapore, and I live in Tasmania, which is right at the bottom of Australia. And
Mm,
it's with permission, you can tune into the property. So that person's higher self or soul energy, whatever you want to call it, knew that you would understand. It's almost like, it sounds like that person needed someone to acknowledge it happening, and you were the
yeah,
one.
it was interesting. It was the only person I told, like I said, is my grandmother, and she's
Yeah.
passed. So it's like there's no sort of like evidence to
No,
prove that that
but you know
happened
what?
other than,
We always think we need evidence, but we just need to trust our intuition, like you were saying. You're trusting it more and more and more now, and it's showing
yeah,
you more and more. And that's what I find as well. When I trust it and don't doubt it, like the umbrella experience, just take the umbrella. And you're going, no,
right.
no,
That's
no.
what's happening when I go out and do the tarot readings. Like a lot of the journey was like trusting the gift because sometimes you'll get a message and you're like, what does that even mean? But it's not for you, it's for the client. And it's like you have to trust that you just give it to them and they can, either receive it or do as they wish with it. And it's not so much about like you and your ego and trying to be correct.
Yeah, yeah. And we're also quite often worried about being judged, because people who do this
Yes.
sort of work, oh, you're charlatans, oh, you're cold reading, oh, you've got on Facebook and you know everything about this person. But the really random information, I find that is where the treasure is. That is where the really important information is for clients. Have you got an experience that you could share with us? Not sharing clients' privacy, obviously, the private information, about where something has really clicked for a client, something that you've given them that has really been life changing. Do you have any experiences like that that you could share?
It's sort of like you know, having almost like a knowing of like what's going on with their relatives that have passed. Like I had one woman, sitting, and I just suddenly had this like knowing like that her mother had passed, and like that she was this client was continuing to like bake her recipes and cook her dishes and things like that. So I like said that to her. I was like, "Oh, it's almost like she's watching you make the dishes." And like the woman just started crying. She was like, "Oh, like I love her recipes, and like that means so much to me." And I had another client recently, her husband had passed, and then she was talking about her son who had passed, and it's like that's really hard because the saying is like parents shouldn't have to bury their children, but her son, I believe it was like age 49, and suddenly I got this instance like to just tell her that they're together on the other side. So that made her cry because she was just like, "Oh, like that makes me feel so much better." So sometimes it's just kind of letting them know like what's going on or what it is you're getting.
But when you own it and just give that information to people, that's really important because, like you said, that can trigger emotions, which at the time might make them feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's really healing. It's really a big release for people. Have you had any personal paranormal experiences that are memorable? Something that is really stuck in your mind, whether it be from childhood or from
Yeah.
adulthood? That'd be great. Would you like to share those with us?
Yeah, so I've got like, at least three really memorable ones. So the first one I remember, I don't remember how old I was, at least old enough to drive. So at least, 16, 17, 18. We were getting ready to go to like a shopping mall. And I remember I was like so excited to go for some reason. And I was running up the stairs in my childhood home. And I was probably about two steps from the top. And suddenly I felt almost like I was like pushed, and it raised me up, and I fell on my hands and knees, like at the top of the stairs. So I was like, "Oh my goodness, like what was that?" And it's interesting because to me it's like paranormal stuff like makes me uncomfortable despite the work that I do, but like talking about like ghosts and like entities and all that stuff, like I have a friend who does a podcast show, and he had someone that does ghost hunting on, and I listened to the episode, and the entire time I had like chills, and I was like freaking out just because when I get chills it's almost like stuff is true, and it was just like so uncomfortable. But anyhow, the next instance, I remember I was working in a bank. So this would have been around 2006, 2007. And I was working on my bachelor's degree at college. And I had left work, and I was walking down through the parking lot, and I was holding like the books for class, like on my chest. And I remember feeling like I had been pushed from behind. And I remember I fell down, and it was like, oh, goodness me. Like, I don't know why it's like that. But that was another one. And then the most recent one, I was at a historical center, actually set up for like a psychic fair, right? So I was doing readings and things like that. And the belief was that this historical center is haunted. So they were doing like an overnight investigation and all that stuff. So we were there during the daytime for the psychic fair. And I remember I was placed in like a room to get set up, and all the rooms were like decorated from way back in the day because that was the historical center's, decor. And I'm like a little bit of a busybody, like kind of nosy. So I saw this door kind of like tucked in the corner, and I was like, oh, I wonder what's in there. I kind of want to open it. And there was like, mannequins in front of it. So I kind of moved those out of the way, and I opened the door, and all of a sudden, like this energy just like hit me. And like my third eye started like, I don't know, like hurting, and just it felt awful. And like really like difficulty hearing, but I could hear my guides being like, shut that door, shut the door. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I closed the door. And I remember getting like a piece of selenite, like for those that are into crystals, and I put it like on my third eye, and I was just holding it there because it was that bad. And there were other individuals doing readings there at the time. So some of them were have the ability to turn the mediumship on and off. So they came into the room, and they were like, oh, there's like an older lady in the corner. I guess you like disrupted her things, and she just wants to be alone with her sewing. And you came in here and moved the stuff around. So she wasn't too happy with you. So needless to say, I, moved my table and everything and set my stuff up out in a different space. And I still was feeling like way off. And I remember my guides being like, go outside under the sun, like let the sunlight hit you. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went down outside because the fair wasn't that busy. So, I was out on the porch, like just standing in the sunlight, just allowing myself to feel better. And luckily it worked.
Now, I have some similar experiences to yourself, so I kind of understand where you're coming from. What I've learnt is that spirits and dark and the demonic level beings, they're just two different levels of darkness that I deal with. So that's just the two names that I give them. Spirits, dark and demonic beings are aware of us all the time. You don't have to go to an old dilapidated building to be around spirits or the darker energies. They're everywhere. They are within every place, in every environment in our world. That is just because it's like the worlds intercollide. We're all
Because we're in
intermingled.
duality, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
have, you label it good and bad, but it's neither. It simply is.
It's neither. And the dark energies are just doing their job. Like I talk about it on my podcast all the time. They're not here to frighten us or hurt us or do horrible things. They'll trigger us if we have a potential or if we have something within us that is already there. They can enhance mental health issues. They can enhance particular addictions and things, but we're not here to talk about that. But the reason why I'm saying that is that these beings are aware of energy workers, and you're classed as an energy worker because your energy shines in a different way to your average person that's just going to work and doing their family. And you're passionate about what you do. So sometimes the spirits or the darker energies can feel a little bit threatened. This is what I've learnt. And that they'll use different things like tripping or pushing or that big wave of energy that you got in your face. I've experienced that in a health food store around 50 other people and no one else could feel it. And I'm looking like the weirdo in the shop. Couldn't move forward in this shop. And everyone else is like, what is wrong with you? But I just knew there was something there that didn't want me there. So what I've learnt now is if I go to events and I'm doing palmistry or numerology, or I'm staying in a space that I haven't been to before, is that I let the energy beings know that I'm coming. I say the address, I see the place in my mind, I let them know that I'm coming, that I'm not doing any energy work while I'm here. I'm simply visiting a friend or I'm going to the shop. Or if I'm staying in a place, I'll say, look, I'm going to be in room 22 tonight. I just want to let anyone know that's in room 22. I'm going to be here for 2 nights. That seems to settle them. They don't seem to get agitated when they know why this bright energy is wafting around in their space. So that could be some of the things you might think about next time you go to a place and you're going to be doing readings in a particular room that might feel a bit odd or a bit weird, is you can say it in your mind, but I find saying it out loud carries more vibration. Is that you just announce that you're here, that you're not interested in what the person's doing. Please just go about whatever it is that you're doing. I'm here to do this for 1 or 2 or 3 days, and thank you for letting me share the space. And I find that really works.
Yeah, that reminds me of I had done some reading into like pets that can like sort of sense the other side or sense entities, things like that. So I had, my soul dog recently passed and he was able to sense, like he would be like in a corner, like barking. So I remember one time when he was younger that happened. He was like barking at like the ceiling. And I remember saying like, okay, like, whatever it is you're here to do, like this is the wrong space for you. Why don't you go somewhere where you can be more like productive or something? And sure enough, it left.
That's it. Because it's because we can't see them. I mean, some people can. Some people are very visual with the spirit world. I'm glad I'm not, because they're everywhere. It would drive you a little bit bonkers trying to work out
Mm.
who's living and who's not living. But just announcing that you're there and just going, hi, I'm just coming to share the space. And they seem to settle. They just seem to settle. And I find even through all types of communication, which you might find this is a thing. If you do Zoom calls with your clients, you might get hit with that wafting wave of don't come here type energy because they feel threatened. But you're not there to threaten them. You're there to talk with the person. Earlier on, you talked about past lives. Do you want to talk about that a little bit as part of the work that you do? How what has happened to you in past lives you feel maybe not necessarily affecting you now, but it's sort of left imprints on the way that you work.
Yeah, so I got interested in past lives when, reading and hearing about it as people were saying, like, oh, sometimes the things that you do in this life are things that you're afraid of, or, challenges that you have. It might be, what they call residue from a past life or something you didn't work through, or some, it's just, basically kind of connected to your soul, I guess. So I started looking into it, and I had like a past life regression done. I've actually had three done, but I came to discover that this type of work that I'm doing, I was like persecuted in a past life for it, I believe hung, like burnt at the stake a few times, like things like that. And it's almost like having difficulty with sharing my voice because of that. And also, feeling like others don't believe me, like that sort of thing, like comes up as a really big challenge. So I remember one time I was on my way to work, and I used to work in the city because my day job was in law enforcement. So the traffic was like completely gridlocked. And all of a sudden I heard this voice randomly be like, "Do you want to see what happened?" And I was like, "Sure, I guess so." And all of a sudden, like almost instantly, like I tranced out. I don't know how to describe it, but I'm like sitting in the vehicle, and all of a sudden I tranced out, and I can see almost like the stake there. Like I'm like strapped up and everything. And all of a sudden I start to see the flames come up, and I start to almost like chant, like, "Nobody believes me. No, they don't believe me." And then all of a sudden, like I trance right back, and I'm back in the city in the traffic, and there's like tears coming down my face. And I'm like, oh goodness, like that was, rather enlightening, although unsettling.
Do you feel like that's part of healing? I find these segments that we're shown help us heal energy that's coming through with us from past lives. So you releasing that what you were shown and the tears and feeling that emotion brings it up and sort of gets it out of your, I call it the system, but you know what I mean. It's not something that you're going to carry anymore because you're starting to own it, like you own who you are through the work that you do.
Yeah, it's for me, I find like I like to study like people and why do they do what they do. It's just sort of like be like the observer. So with that, it's sort of like understanding why, like why do I have difficulty sharing, and why, is it nerve-wracking to be like, oh, like this is the kind of work I do? Because I sort of like used to hide behind like the identity of being in law enforcement. It would be like, oh, I'm in law enforcement, take me seriously. And oh, I do tarot readings on the side for fun, like take me seriously.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge to work on both sides.
Oh, so we can talk about, when my soul dog actually passed, because we mentioned him a little bit earlier in this segment. He was about 12 years old, and he was a pug. So he had the issue where the vet called it the signal from his brain wasn't going all the way down his spine to his back legs. So they had started dragging. So when he was about 1 years old, I remember he was in his, kennel, just kind of relaxing after playing one day. And I was looking at him, and I was like, someday he's gonna die. And I just was like all sad. And my main guide was like, his legs will be his demise. And I was like, oh, so, now fast forward 11 years later, it was on a Monday morning, and I had gotten him up to, start his day, and he could hardly walk. Like he was just kind of standing there looking at me. And previously he had injured his shoulder. So I thought, maybe something was wrong with his shoulder and he's just having difficulty. So I had leftover painkillers. So I gave him that, and then, just went about my day, and he ended up sleeping because I think, he was arthritic and all these other things. So the painkiller allowed him to sleep. Now, that evening, I had to do tarot readings because I work for a small shop. And I had noticed that, it was getting closer to the time that I had to start. So I'm like, all right, let me take him out, get him situated, let him have his dinner. And I took him outside, and he just stood there, and he was just looking at me and refused to move. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, what do I do? So I, brought him back inside, put him back in his bed. I started, the session at the shop. It was about a 3 hour shift, but I only had one client that night and, did the reading for her. It went really, really well. And then later on, it was getting further and further in the evening. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I think I have to take him to the vet. And so I sort of started like dissociating mentally because it was almost like I knew what was going on, but I didn't want to feel it. So I remember, I was trying to like do laundry and I was, hand feeding him because he wouldn't stand up and eat. And I just kept, feeding him handfuls and then leaving and coming back. And then, I decided I'm going to take him to the vet. So we have an emergency vet in our area. So I went to put him in the car. I carried him out, put him in, and his something was wrong with his tail and it wouldn't like go into the car. So I was like, how do I shut the door? And all of a sudden, like all the guides, like in a chorus, they're all like just started apologizing. And I'm like, oh no, like the fact that they're doing that, it means like it's bad. Like this is it. So somehow I finally managed to get the door shut. And at that point, I heard this really rich voice. It was like, if you could have one wish, what would it be? And I was like, I knew it was pertaining to my dog. So I was like, swift, make it swift. Don't let him suffer, please.
Oh.
So I managed to get in the car, and all of a sudden I heard them being like, this is the last car ride. And I was like, oh no. So I'm driving down towards the vet, and somehow my brain just decided to take the long way. And I put my hand on his shoulder, and it was sort of like, running energy through him. And, I'm getting closer, and I decided to call to say that, we're on our way and this is what's happening. And somehow they didn't really believe. It was almost like girl who cried wolf. So they were just like, oh, like maybe you should stay home. And I was just like, this is bad. Like we're coming. And the girl could like hear the car sounds in the background. So she was like, oh, you're already on your way. So we get there. I carried him in and they were like, oh, can we get a weight on him? Can you put him on the scale? So I put him on the scale and all of a sudden he just collapsed like a pancake. So they were like, oh, this is really bad. So they took him out back and, I had to sit in the waiting room. So I was just kind of there waiting. And luckily, I had a really compassionate vet. So she came out and she was telling me, the three different options. She's like, I could give him a different painkiller. Like if you think it's just his shoulder, maybe it'll help him out. And then she said you could wait for neurology because if it's the signal from the brain and it's almost like stopping at the back of his head, that's why he can't walk. And I'm thinking, he's older now. I don't think, we should do that. And then she said, or we can just help him out. Like we can, put him down with euthanasia. So I was like, okay, we need to do that. So they set it up, put us in a room, and they had said, you can have as much time with him as you want. Like it's perfectly okay. And all of a sudden, all the guides were like, you're putting off the inevitable. Like you just have to do it. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I didn't know what to say. And because he was my soul dog, whenever I was upset, he would always try to comfort me, but not this time. He's just sort of looking at me like nothing, like he was already gone. So the finally I got the vet to come in and she's explaining how it's going to happen and I'm thinking, oh god, like why are you telling me like the awful details. And so she starts the whole process and I kind of had my hands out like towards him because I didn't know what else to do. And all of a sudden I felt almost like in what I'll call like his essence like brushed over my wrists and I was like, oh my goodness, like I think that's it. And within like a minute and a half my team was like, he's here, we've got him. So I was like, oh my goodness. And then the vet's like, oh, let me get, my stethoscope and check him out. And I was like, he's already gone. Like, what do you what do you want to say? So she told me, he was gone. And then she was like, you can stay here as long as you want, like sit with him, whatever. So she left the room. And again, the guides were like, you're putting off the inevitable. You need to go home and sleep. And I was like, oh, like, what do I do? So I just left because I didn't know what else to do. And then I think it was the next night, because I have fellow pug friends and they were all like hysterically crying, like, that's so awful. We feel for you. And like, I was like dry bone, like just nothing. And so I was sitting in bed and the guides were like, you need to sit with this. You need to stop, trying to get the distractions or scrolling on your phone, whatever. And so I put down the phone and I'm sitting there. It's approximately 10 o'clock at night. So this was, 24 hours later. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what should I do now? What is this entailing? And then I thought, should I be like the fellow pug moms and crying? So this one guide that was sitting there, he's like, this is the dog's final gift to you because you can't go through your whole life not feeling anything. So I was like, oh, like what does that mean? And he was like, what does it feel like that your beloved dog is gone? And I was like, I just lost it. Like all the hysterical crying and all of that came, and it's been like a lot to process. But just, I was talking to a friend about it and she's like, no, most people don't know when crossing over, when they hit the other side. Like the fact that they told you that he was there, it's like, that's like a special gift. Yeah,
It's
I mean, I had
trauma.
questioned, did I like do it right? Should I have done something different? Should I have done it in the morning? Should I? And the guides were like, would you have been able to do the reading for that client if the dog had died? And I was like, no, probably not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's amazing how it all works, isn't it? And the fact that
Right.
you saw that he was there on the other side and that he's there and they told you that he's there is just like, oh, so special, isn't it? Really, really is
Yeah,
really special when you know that they're safe and that they'll be waiting for you when your time comes down the track. That's
right.
just
I've read about that.
when my dad passed. I'll share this because it's relevant to what you're saying. I had a lady that I didn't know. She knew none of my history, and we were some friends and I were visiting her, and she said, "Your dad's here," and it was still really fresh. She'd only died like a month ago,
Oh,
and
wow.
she went through this process of telling me all these things, and I didn't know her, so there's not like she's done any background research just to, and it wasn't a paid thing. It was just random, and she went, "There's a little black dog." Which was their little black Steffi cross called
Oh,
Steffi, or Staffy cross called Steffi.
yeah.
And she said, "There's a little black dog there with your dad." And this was probably 20 years ago when this happened. And I know now that animals, they're a soul energy. They go exactly where our
Yeah.
souls go. Because some
Yeah.
people question it. They go, "Oh, I don't know. Do animal souls go to heaven?" Is what people just use that as a general term. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. They're there and they're waiting for you and they can't wait to see you again. Yeah, it's
Yeah, like he was
amazing.
my soul dog, because he could like read me like a book and he was almost intuitive himself. And, I would be thinking whatever thoughts and he would come over with those pug eyes, and stare at me like, really? Really? And I'm like, ugh.
Talk about he was
Yeah,
there to
it's funny
support
because now
you.
you're reminding me of the paranormal piece. So I was in, like a Pilates fitness class, a couple months after he had passed. And I had put out my mat. We were doing the whole class. And at one point, I walked to the top of the mat and I almost like tripped over something. And I was like, what was that? And the guides were like, that's your dog. He's curled up on the mat. And I was
Oh,
like, oh goodness, like he used to do that, from time to time. And then another time, I went into my son's room and I think I was going to put something away or do something. And I was so upset when my boy had passed, that I'm a nurturer and it's like, the dog becomes like part of your routine. So after he passed, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. And it's like, oh, you need to go out and do your healing work and, put more time into your business. And I literally like shook my fist at the sky. Like, the energies in the earth are so dense and it's such a difficult time. And you want me to go do this work, but you took my dog. So about 3 weeks after he passed, I was given another dog. And her story is the same as his. So I'm like, all right, like we were meant to be together. But anyhow, I was in my son's room and I turned around and I literally saw my boy. Like his name was Charlie. I saw Charlie, but I was like, oh, is it her? But she's considerably smaller because she's a puppy. So for like a brief instance, and as soon as my brain like clicked, like, oh, like what is that? He, disappeared. But yeah.
yeah, it does happen. It's just amazing. I was at another friend's house one day and we were just talking and she walked me to the car. And as I turned around to say goodbye, I could see this very long German shepherd standing behind her with his tongue. All I could see really was his tongue because they've got really big tongues and a big head. And she didn't have a German Shepherd now, but she had one 15
Mm.
years ago. And I said,
Oh,
You've
wow.
got a dog behind you. And she went, What? I said, It's a German Shepherd. Long, skinny, big head, big tongue. Like, I only saw it for maybe 3 seconds, but it was so
Yeah, same with
random
Charlie.
because I was looking at her face. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing this dog. And it's like the animal, her pet, wanted her to know that he's still there looking after her, Just beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. So exciting. I
Yeah.
love it. Love it. Beverley, would you like to tell everybody about your services, about your podcast, about your website? Share what you offer to people and how people can contact you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my friend and I just started a podcast. It's called Ready, Set, Share. And so for, both myself and her, because we're very similar, it's about kind of speaking up and sharing our voice that was maybe silenced either in childhood or past lives, as we just talked about. So you can find us on Instagram at the.rss podcast. And then for my work, actually my website just opened. It's called hummingbirdenergyhealing.com. And I offer, tarot readings with life coaching, and I do energy work. So I run along the chakra system and sort of like working with like blockages and where people are being held back and what they can do to sort of empower themselves in the now so that they can create the future that they want.
That's great. Thank you. And of course, I will share all your socials and all your contact details in the description box. Thank you so much for coming on today, Beverley. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So thank you for joining me today. And don't forget, if you want to share a paranormal experience just with myself, or you would like me to share one of your experiences through my podcast, you can do a voice recording, or you can write out your experience and I will read it exactly as you have written. You can email me at spiritualbeing44@gmail.com. And for information on paranormal house clearing, you can visit my website, Spiritual Being. You will find the address in the description box. And I look forward to sharing this spooky space again with you next week. And remember, life is perfectly paranormal.